Thank you for coming. I'd like to thank the Science and Tech Club for having me here today. Welcome to my show called Otzi the Ice Man, His Life, Times, and Death. Since this is about a man who was frozen for 5,000 years, I thought I was going to originally title this The Iceman Cometh, or The Iceman, or Frozen, or Mr. Freeze, the freeze frame effect, or Icing the Kicker. However, on September 19, 1991, at 1:30 in the afternoon, 3,200 meters above sea level, Erica and Helmut Simon, shown below here, were two tourists from Nuremberg, Germany, and were hiking while vacationing in the Otzi Alps. The Otzi Alps are right on the border where the X marks the spot in both maps between Italy and Austria. And they decided to take a shortcut. And when they walked past a rocky gully filled with meltwater, they saw what they first thought was rubbish. However, it turned out to be a body partially submerged in glacial meltwater, and they thought it was a hiker who had been killed, and they rushed down to the village. The village authorities came up to investigate, and the authorities saw what they've never seen ever before. Later on, they would call this person Otzi for the mountains he was found in. He was 10,000 feet up in the northern pass of the Val Senales in Italy, 300 feet from the Austrian border. He was protected from the ice of the Niedernacht Glacier because the glacier moved above his body, allowing him to stay in place securely. It was really a shallow basin with large rocks around it, protecting his body from being ground up by glacial activity. And Otzi is Europe's oldest natural mummy. He lived between 3,350 BC to 3,100 BC in the early Bronze Age. He is 5,300 years old or so and lived 1,000 years before the Great Pyramids were built, and even lived during the times when the woolly mammoths were living in Siberia. He lived around the time the wheel was invented and writing was invented. This program concerns forensic anthropology and the facts plus interpretive evidence surrounding the life and lifestyle of this man. And here he is being taken in a body bag out of the mountain to be examined. Otzi is remarkably well preserved, and we have obtained quite a bit of information from his body, clothes, and artifacts he was carrying. He spent his life in the picture shown above in the Val Venista Valley of northern Italy, which is just south and at the base of the tall mountains he was discovered in. When he was found, he was desiccated, freeze-dried, and had shrunk and weighed 29 pounds and was 5'2". However, when he was alive and just before his death, he was 5'4", was 45 years of age, and weighed between 110 and 130 pounds. His shoe size was 7.5. He had brown eyes and light-colored skin. His light skin helped him absorb vitamin D, and his long, straight hair helped him insulate his head, neck, and shoulders. His compact body allowed him to conserve heat. He had an ectomorph-type body because long legs and long arms are harder to keep warm. And he was Homo sapien. Otzi lived a life of farming and herding. We know this due to the condition of his hands, which were not worn and rough from hard labor. He also hunted and trapped wild animals and was a farmer. He was an agro-pastoralist, or a farmer livestock herder. Where he lived, he took care of domesticated sheep, goats, and cows, plus he farmed. He lived with other people who were hunters and farmers in a small pastoral mountain village that we don't know much about. Having domesticated animals and seasonal crops meant that these people could live in a permanent village without being nomadic. This then led to other larger villages, which would lead to towns and ultimately to cities. Their diet of these wild and domesticated animals meant that these people could get more energy from their meats and fats. With this excess energy, they were able to stay warmer, plus have the time to do other activities without constantly having to search and forage for food, which is the case for a vegetarian diet in those days. Other activities meant building, making things, creating, playing, building, making music, or even building larger vocabularies, or even writing. The language he spoke was a dialect from the Romania area that is now extinct. His DNA reveals he has 19 genetic relatives in Austria's Tyrol region that's still alive. His maternal DNA line went extinct. His DNA is related to ancient Corsicans or Sardinians, which lived on northern Mediterranean islands just south of France and Italy. His ancestors were probably from the Near East, and they were of farming stock or ancestry, and they took their farming ideas to Middle Europe. This northern flow of people from the out of Africa theory validates this. The blue line to the left illustrates this migratory move into southeastern Europe tens of thousands of years ago and is now the accepted standard model. Otzi had type O blood, was lactose intolerant, and he also had gum disease, which is periodontal disease, and tooth decay. He had multiple cavities, one for instance shown here. And he had a space of 3 millimeters between his two front teeth, right there, or right there, and that is called diastema. That occurs in about 5% of the population now. That means he wouldn't be able to be handsome enough to go to Hollywood. He also lacked wisdom teeth, which would have been here or here, and his teeth were worn on the left side due to the chewing of leather, which to make it more supple and easier to work with. He lacked a 12th pair of ribs, and his DNA suggests he had worn joints from walking in the mountains herding sheep. He spent hours walking in mountain passes. We know this because of the inflammatory disease of bone attachments to his knees. His right hip showed signs of aging as he had a small fracture in his hip due to wear and tear. This also means he was right-dominated or right-handed, since his right area was had more muscle than his left area. And he had little fat on his body. His lungs were discolored from being around smoky fires. Otzi had high levels of copper, zinc, and arsenic, and some heavy metals from smelting copper necessary for making hardened tools. He had gallstones. He also had Lyme's disease from always being in a conifer forest, and he had fleas from always sleeping on the ground. He had parasitic worms called whipworm, which attacks the pelvis. The parasite eggs were in his colon, which means maybe he had dysentery. He ingested fungus, kind of like a mushroom, to treat his whipworm. This fungus was still being used until the turn of the 20th century to treat internal disorders. He also had hardened arteries, which means he had a genetic disposition to cardiovascular disease. This is arteriosclerosis, or plaque buildup in the arteries that can lead to a constriction of blood flow, which can lead to a heart attack. That means despite his very highly publicized and taunted and Neolithic diet and caveman diet, he still had this kind of disease, which means either A, we are predetermined to have this kind of disease, or B, he needed a lot of fat to be able to sustain energy in this kind of alpine environment. And 1 fingernail and 2 toenails were found, and he had bow lines in the fingernails. These are modern examples at the top here, which means his immune system was compromised and showed signs of stress. When you are very sick, the sickness actually shows up in lines in your fingernails to tell you that there's a problem, that your body's recognizing it. He had, and this sickness concerns 3 bouts of sickness in his last 6 months of life, his last bout some 2 months before his death. He was fortunate to live to the age of 45, given the harsh alpine environment he lived in, because I'm sure procuring food and staying warm were of top concerns. So if he hadn't died up in the mountains, he would have died from these kind of diseases and problems mentioned, which were very common in those days, and why people didn't live that long in the first place. To live past 35 was difficult then, because there was no effective treatment for infections or maladies. After all, 1 abscessed tooth could kill you. So, due to his age, he might have been considered an elder or a leader in his village, which carried some power, respect, and authority. Currently, Otzi is preserved in the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology in Bolzano, Italy. It was an old bank building that was converted into a museum for $10 million. And Italy and Austria had a massive legal tug of war as to who would claim lay claim to Otzi's body. Obviously, Italy won in court. The Simons had to go to court too. They were just compensated a few $100s for their fine, and they sued the Italian government and received a settlement with them of $300,000 as a finder's fee. And currently, Otzi is in a room that is 21 degrees Fahrenheit, which is humidity and temperature controlled. And if he was taken out of this room and put in room temperature, he would start to mold up and liquefy within 2 or 3 hours. So far, 5 million people have come to visit his body. He is a national treasure of Italy and is beloved by the Italian people. And if you want to know what he looked like, forensic data was taken and placed into a 3D computer imaging program, and they used clay and hair to model a face. And this is what they got. Now, they do this in high-profile forensic cases, cold cases, and certainly Otzi was the original cold case. And Otzi had some cuts on him that we'll talk about later, which means Otzi had the original cold cuts. No baloney about that. And so this is him with his maker. And he also had 61 tattoos on him. These tattoos, to make these tattoos, his skin was scratched and charcoal was put on the scratches. These tattoos are mainly in joint areas as a way of relieving pain. Here's one on his knee. Here's one on his torso, and here's one on his wrist. The tattoos acted like a primitive acupuncture because 80% of them are in acupuncture lanes. And the Chinese invented acupuncture 2,000 years ago with quills. Well, this type of acupuncture was 3,000 years before that, but it was extremely simplistic, rudimentary, and crude. And it's been thought that here's some, by the way, on his torso and on his wrists, on the front and back of him, and the red marks and where the numbers are. And it's been thought that the excessive amount of tattoos was because he was a shaman or medicine man in his community. However, the joint theory better explains the tattoos. Please note that when we're talking about ancient peoples, not everything is super mysterious, spiritual, or mystical about them in nature. This over-romanticizes them, and archaeology and anthropology should never come across like some giddy 12-year-old playing a Tomb Raider video game. And about his private parts, his genitalia area was collapsed, so he had frozen assets. About his clothes, he wore them in layers to keep warm. And as you see here, he had a tunic made of goat skin or sheepskin, actually kind of a loincloth. And then he would put on leggings, same material, same sheepskin or goat skin, as well as a tunic made from that. And this made it a lot easier for him then to relieve himself when he's outside. And next he would put on shoes, a belt with a knife, an overcoat, and then a hat, and then his equipment. And we'll get into all this right now. So this is what it actually came down to. Here was part of his leggings that he had. And here was the hat that he had with a leather strap on it, from leather from a dried cow skin. And this was his utility belt. He had a quiver with arrows here, a medicine kit right here, birch bark containers that acted like buckets, a overcoat on him like a poncho kind of tunic that would help him keep dry, his knife with a sheath, a tool resharpener, his shoes, part of a backpack, and some arrows. And we'll go into these individually right now. So, his leggings were made from domesticated goat leather, and what that means is they would take a goat or a sheep and kill it and take the hide and stretch it out and dry it and then cut it to shape. And then over everything he had on this like a cape made of dried plant material that would keep him dry from rain and snow, and it was like a waterproof kind of, like a blanket over him. And on top of his head he had a brown bear skin hat, and he had tassels underneath them from leather to be able to hold it in place. And these hats are very much in common nowadays. Actually, they're used very much by Russian dignitaries. They're very vogue today. And it says that wearing them makes you have more of an even temperament and greater intelligence. Well, maybe. And so here were some of his things that he wore: his hat, his leggings, his overcoat, his shoes, and that waterproof cape that we're going to talk about next, which would look like more like this. It would keep him dry. Underneath this waterproof cape, he would have a coat here, and it was an overcoat that seemed haphazardly patched together with goat and sheep hide. These patches were sewn together with a bone needle, right here, and they used strips of animal skin as lacing. So Otzi had to be an expert tailor. If his coat came undone, or the patches came undone that he sewed up, they came unraveled or they fell apart when he was in the alpine wilderness, this could be a disaster. He could easily get hypothermia or frostbite for him. And this would be a terrible thing. So he did carry a bone owl with him in his utility belt that we'll get to. And about his shoes, well, he's actually found with one shoe on. And this is remarkable because we have appliances here in our kitchen that last just 10 years. But his shoe lasted 500 times longer than our appliances do. So how he would make them? Well, he would start with this first. A kind of lacing that he would have from these leather strips that he would put together as like a lacing, like a webbing on his foot. He'd have them all tied up, and on top of that then he'd attach deerskin panels, and underneath that, the sole of his feet, he'd have bearskin soles. This all made it waterproof. But the real part here was that he had to make these waterproof, which is what they were, and they all had to stay together. That's why he needed a lot of lacing on his shoes. He also stuffed his shoes with soft grass or hay that was tucked inside them as a cushioning effect, plus insulation. A more detailed and more look at this is what actually was left over. Here was that webbing he would have. Here was the shoe that was intact. You can see the grass stuffings as well as the lacing keeping it all together. And a more idealized version of the shoes looks like this. This is in the Bolzano Museum. That would look like this, and the lacing was real important. Imagine your shoe falling apart when you're 3 miles away from your village. You're going to have frostbite on your foot. So that's why it all had to stay together. And part of his backpack was found, really, just the hoop here and the lower slats. And he also had a utility belt with a pouch sewn into it, which this utility belt held a tool resharpener, a piece of fungus, some flint, a scraper, a borer, which is an owl to bore things with, and a bone needle. And he also had on his knife. Now, as you can see, the knife had a string onto it as well as a tool resharpener. And he had to have them attached to his belt or his wrist whenever he worked, because if these two tools fell off when he was in the middle of the alpine wilderness, in the dark or in the snow or in a rocky mountain pass, and if he lost these, he'd be in real trouble. So that's why he had to have them attached to himself in some way or to his belt. So we'd have a utility belt here with these kind of tools and equipment. And he had herbs in his toolkit. He had herbs such as birch bracket fungus, a kind of a mushroom, used for stomach and digestive tract issues. Since the foods he ate were often raw and hard to digest, it may have caused him some internal discomfort. These foods were not as soft and palatable as the foods we eat today, and they were not seasoned. And he also had a piece of fungus on a string that many believe were part of a prehistoric medicine kit, kind of like a natural Rolaids. And here's about his copper axe, with a handle on it from a yew tree. The copper axe was 99.7% copper. It was cold forged, polished, and sharpened. And it was so strong that it could fell a pine tree in about 35 minutes. The axe was so well made that it would have been a status symbol in his day, which means Otzi might have been a person of importance in his community, like a leader or elder. Now, this axe was used to get kindling for fires, and also to make simplistic, crude huts that they would need to live in. Now, the copper axe was made from malachite, a copper carbonate that appears bluish-green on rock and cliff sides. It was then scraped off the rock and then smelted in a crucible back here over a campfire. The heat of the fire was increased by blowing oxygen through bellows. The bellows were made from probably goat skin or sheepskin with some sticks in between to hold them together. The pure copper was then poured into a stone mold right here, and the axe showed that people in the Alpine possessed greater technology and was more sophisticated than previously thought. Now, Otzi's village, shown here in the X, was really on a copper trading route, which explains the importance of copper smelting. The route was called the Carpathian Route and was the green snaky line going through Middle Eastern Europe here. And this was by the Carpathian Mountains, which are northeast of where Otzi lived. Copper, furs, and goods were traded on this route, which extended for hundreds of miles. There was no money in those days. The first money was invented about 3,000 years later. So when these traders came into an area where Otzi lived, where the red X is, they often brought with them news from far away. This was similar to a mail route, but delivered in words and goods. Sometimes these traders told of new ideas about farming, herding, hunting, and new technologies and techniques to improve their lives. Now, where the blue X is, that's where they found tin. And when you smelt copper and then add tin in at a 12% level, it becomes bronze. And bronze was a very important tool for making household implements, farming tools, as well as weapons, and became known as the Bronze Age. So there were other routes in other areas here in Europe, as well as in Asia, these kind of trading routes. In Asia, they had, for instance, the Silk Route and the Tea Route. There they would trade, traders would trade silk, salt, tea, and spices. And often these routes were made from old animal trails, or they would take their goods and put them on rafts to make it easier to traverse areas. Later on, they would also they would take slaves and hop from island to island trading slaves. But either way, no matter how these traders went, they needed to have a destination to go to, someplace to barter and sell their goods. So they needed small hamlets then would come up and arise where they stopped, and these later on became larger towns, that became villages, that became larger cities, and more urbanized areas. So this is how this started out. This is how we have cities to live in through these kind of trading routes. Later on, these routes would also spread religion and reading and writing. Getting back to Otzi, in his quiver he had 14 arrows and 2 had flint blades on them. Just 2. These are the 2 that had them on, and this is a close-up of them, front and back. He wasn't a very good flint maker. We've seen better in museums, but it was enough to get the job done. He also had a bow that was 6 feet long or 72 inches, and he would carry that. And here was his quiver made of deerskin, and these are the kind of tools that he would have to be able to fix his arrows, as well as his flint blades and a tool sharpener. And this is what you would see in the museum, by the way, how he carried his bow, probably. And this is the actual quiver and arrows that he would carry, with 2 just having, actually 1 and another one here, just having blades on them. And this was a knife that he carried. It was a flint knife with a ash handle and a sheath to it. And of course, he would have this attached to his belt, as discussed. And he'd also have strips of leather holding up his leggings. If they fell down, he'd also have a problem. So these are all his things, more in a 3D effect. And a lot was lost when Otzi was moved. His backpack, for example, well, we're not exactly sure how it was worn, over the shoulders or over the head, but probably over the shoulders like we would wear it. Because actually, much of his equipment he used for alpine hiking are the same as what we would use today, but just the materials are different. Also, the deerskin quiver that he had, we're not sure how that was carried, as there was no strap but probably over his shoulders. Now, here was his coat that he'd wear, that haphazardly patched together quilt of goat and sheepskin. And here was a netting that he would have weighted on each corner, and he was able to throw this netting over slow-moving birds like ducks, geese, wild chickens, or turkeys. And here were some buckets that he carried. Actually, they were made of birch bark, and on the bottom was adhered bottom was adhered to it, probably with pine sap from yew trees. And he also had a handle on them, on these containers. And he would use them. He would take maple leaves and place hot embers of them in them, and then carry fire from place to place rather than make it from scratch. So that's how they probably did it in those days. But just in case, he had a fire starter right here. He also had his hat, his bow, 6-foot-long bow, an arrow, his knife, piece of ibex meat, this is what this means, his utility belt, and his leggings that he held up with leather straps, and his poncho, the waterproof poncho we've been talking about. And down here were his shoes, and the presence of significant amount of moss suggests he may have used it to wrap his food in, or even as toilet paper for extra insulation. Now, I just wanted to read to you about what he had to make sure that we're on the same page together. Other items found with the Iceman were a fire starter, a birch bark container, a piece of ibex meat, a grass cape, a dagger with an ash handle and flint blade, a sheath, an arrow repair kit, medicine kit, and sometimes pieces of antlers to help him out make arrows. And if we were to say that his society was visited by other ancient civilizations that helped them out with various advanced technologies, as some clubs here in the villages subscribe to, then we would be deluding ourselves. Because if we were to believe these hokey scenarios, there's no evidence of this, and we'd be playing up to our emotional sediments, which we can't do in science. So, in order to appease the tabloid mentality of these fringe groups, here's my idea of what happened to Otzi. Well, he was driving in the snowy Alps with his golf cart here, technology supplied by ancient civilizations. He was using his GPS, his global prehistoric Skynet, when he came to a roundabout. He was trying to get to the village of excessive materialism near Feni de Soto, Austria. He lost control of his prehistoric souped-up street-legal golf cart, and the rest is ancient history. Everybody knows this. Okay, so how about how he died? Actually, Otzi was up in the mountains, and he came down to his village and somehow got involved in a bitter, violent altercation with at least 3 men that he knew. And he got a defensive wound, a deep cut between his thumb and forefinger, and on his right hand. This was from hand-to-hand combat, and it was an injury that occurred between 24 hours and 72 hours before his death. In that combat, he was able to shoot 2 men with the same arrow around the same time. He shot one man with one arrow, took the arrow out, and shot the other man. Must have been part of the Three Stooges here. And he had blood on his overcoat from another individual. That's how we know there were 3 men involved in this violent altercation. And then, from that encounter, he went up into the mountains to escape further or more escalated confrontation. He may have doubled back on his route before he climbed up to avoid his pursuer. He lived around this general area in this valley here and went up the mountains from there to escape. And he left with food, his equipment or mountain gear, and he may have had embers of a fire preserved in those birch bark containers or in his backpack. And he was in no hurry, and at 10,500 feet, which is 2 miles up, he made a camp in a gully on the mountain saddle and placed his belongings around and sat down for his last meal. He didn't take a defensive stand and make more arrows or fix any of his equipment, thinking the worst of the confrontation was over, and placed his axe against a rock. And they actually found 2 meals in his body. The first was meat from a goat-like antelope called a chamos, and the second meal was from a herb bread called eichhorn wheat, some animal fats, sort of like cheese, and red deer meat, and a vegetable porridge. He was resting and enjoying a hearty meal, and of course while he was doing that, he would have a view to die for. And this is more of a timeline on what he would have. He was up in the mountains, came down to his village, had the altercation, stayed there at least a half a day, had another meal, and then progressed up the mountain, where he had another meal about 4 to 5 hours before his death, and another meal about 30 minutes before his death. He needed a lot of food then, because it's a lot of hard work going 2 miles up in that kind of environment. And 30 minutes after his dinner, he was sitting down and he was ambushed. An arrow struck him in the back of his upper left shoulder. The arrow went under his left armpit and ripped through a half-inch section of his subclavian artery. And it was a fatal shot. His killer or attacker had followed him, found him, and tried to finish him off by killing him. His attacker shot him from 100 feet away, which means his attacker didn't want any further personal confrontation with Otzi. Otzi was then flipped over by the murderer, or the attacker, to get the arrow shaft out as to avoid the identity of the killer. We think the shaft was removed from the body prior to death. The arrowhead was still left embedded in his shoulder right here. You can see that. Then Otzi either bled to death, or, as shown in the bottom panel here, he may have had a fatal blow to the head by the killer after the arrow struck him. And we know this because there was severe brain trauma to his brain upon examination. And he was clearly left to die. That's why Otzi was found face down with his arm extended outwards. He died in the spring or early summer and was shortly over time covered in ice with little deterioration. He was ambushed or killed for some personal reason, maybe a vendetta or argument gone terribly wrong. It could have been about territory, animals he was hurting, someone wanted to usurp his elder position, or the Margaritaville syndrome, which is some people claim that there was a woman to blame, but we know it was his own darn fault. Since his body was not posed or hidden by the covering of rocks, we therefore assume his attacker had little remorse for the killing. He was left in an undignified way because the killer really didn't care. The murder was not for robbery, but rather of personal nature that many of us can relate to, especially driving on roundabouts around here. We know that it wasn't robbery, since his attacker may have taken his valuable copper axe and specialized alpine tools previously mentioned. However, if the axe or tools was kept by the attacker, this would immediately imply to others that he was responsible for the disappearance of Otzi. The attacker was probably someone from inside Otzi's village and someone he knew. This kind of information was pieced together by actual cold case detectives to explain his injuries and death. We're not sure if Otzi lived a few days after the arrow strike, or died from loss of blood, or died immediately from the blow to his head, or died from hypothermia, or a combination of all the above. The time frame of his injury and death is not well explained. By studying Otzi, he reveals a fascinating glimpse into the Bronze Age. We now know more about how he lived, his lifestyle, his diet, his social network, his clothing, tools, health, and how he took care of himself. The problems Otzi had are very relatable to anyone living in a small, rural, tight-knit community. Numerous books of fact and fiction have been written about Otzi. You can get them on eBay. And he also is responsible for much paraphernalia. Like, for instance, this shirt. Wearing this shirt makes you want to arrest anyone speaking a foreign language. And he also inspired these kind of Otzi wannabes. And yes, my mummy rocks. And Otzi also was able to inspire this ringtone, which my wife is getting up. And with all that being said, that is the end of my show, and thank you very much.